And here I will start the session. So officially, welcome and good afternoon to session number 5 of our art/practice-based research seminar series. I'm really delighted to have Dr. Charlie Tweed from Bath Spa University with us today. And as most of you probably realize, the subject of the session is dissemination. So the title is "Who is it for and how can we communicate it?" So before I introduce Charlie, just two very quick housekeeping things for the seminar. So I know there's lots of new people joining us today. I just wanted to let you know that there is a Microsoft Teams team dedicated for the seminar, where we have all the information to do with each session and also all the core reading tests for each session. So if you'd like to, I normally add people to the teams when they book for the seminar, but if you're not part of it, and you would like to be, just let me know. I'll add you on. And also, just wanted to remind everyone that we are recording the session. So we are recording this one right now. And all the previous ones are on, it's dedicated to YouTube channel. The easiest way to find all the information is to go to the seminar website, where you find all the links. So even if you've missed anything, you can always go back and just rewatch it. And without further ado, let me just introduce our today's guest. So, as I said, Dr. Charlie Tweed from Bath Spa University. He's the co-course leader for BA Creative Media and also co-director of the Center for Media Research, where he leads the Digital Ecologies Research Group. And he also is a media artist and practice-based researcher who lectures in digital media practice and culture. Now, his performative digital and video-based works have drawn attention to the complex impacts of computational capitalism. Really interesting things over there. And hopefully people had a chance to look at Charlie's work before the session. It's really fascinating what he's doing over there. And some of the things he's looking at is this idea of ecological destruction and the deployment of digital technologies to manage populations and environment. And then in his work, he also employs strategies of reappropriation and speculative fiction, often taking on personal of anonymous collectives and hybrid machines to outline subversive plans for enhancing and escaping control mechanisms and renegotiating relations with non-human. Now, it goes without saying that he also exhibited his work internationally with multiple shows in many different amazing places across the globe, really, including Poland, which I'm very happy to see, really. And he's also worked on a number and keeps working on a number of interdisciplinary projects between science and art, including collaborative projects with the scientist Dr. Darren Logan at the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, Cambridge, which was funded by a Wellcome Trust Large Arts Award and produced by Animate Projects London. He also recently completed an industrial research fellowship at Bristol University's Life Sciences and Earth Sciences, developing a new film which is called Notes from the Subsurface. That was in 2020, and a new performance lecture and a solo exhibition at the part of Earth Art Initiative. But in the past, Charlie also worked in a range of commercial roles, focusing specifically on user experience design, digital strategy, and research. And he has worked as a freelancer with a range of digital agencies and broadcasters. And I took a liberty to share your website, Charlie. I hope you don't mind. And again, if anyone didn't have a chance to look at Charlie's work, I really highly recommend. But I know that Charlie will be talking about his work today as well. That's part of his kind contribution. So I'm going to pass it on to you, Charlie. And then, of course, we're going to take all the questions and have a discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Agatha, for that great introduction. Let me just share my screen. And do let me know if you can see it. Okay.
Yes.
All good. Perfect. Okay. If there's any issue just through this, do just shout, because of course I can't see everyone. So yeah, thanks again, Agatha, for such a great introduction. Yeah, I'm hoping that this session will be really useful today. So I'm really going to talk a lot about publishing practice-based research and a few kind of strategies that I'm going to recommend, and I'm going to look at a number of examples. So I'm going to think about some of the challenges of practice-based outputs. And I'm going to look at a range of kind of journals that are out there already, including the International Journal of Creative Media Research that I set up with my colleague Matt Freeman. And of course, now Agatha is also involved in. So I'm also going to talk about a project called Fiction Machines as well in the kind of final part of the session. And in that project, I'm going to really think about how I constructed a research project that was also a REF submission that began really with just a very short piece of experimental video work. So I really wanted to kind of talk through the kind of way that project kind of built on an initial idea through practice. So a kind of true practice-based research project, and then expanded out into journal special issues, a series of symposia and exhibitions and performances. So I hope that as a result, you'll have a sense of some kind of useful strategies to use if you're thinking of publishing your research in some of the example publications that I look at today. I'm also thinking about how researchers might kind of navigate the mechanisms of traditional academia and the requirements of REF. And maybe there's ways of inventing new models and approaches to help redefine the notion of practice-based research and its dissemination. So I'll think about that a little bit as well. So hopefully you can see my slides moving along. Do shout if they seem to get stuck. So yeah, so a few things I'm going to be looking at today. I will also look at a couple of examples of some other platforms that are out there that I think are quite interesting, that are worth considering as kind of additional way beyond the more standardized kind of journal format. So a little bit on my background then. So Agatha has really summarized it very well there. So yeah, so just to say, yeah, so I'm a media artist. So I work mainly in film and digital media and also with performance. My research explores the kind of social and environmental impacts of digital technologies and their surrounding cultures. And I make a lot of films that are kind of remixed or using appropriated footage. And I've shown those films in all sorts of places like film festivals and also solo shows at galleries like Spike Island in Bristol. And as Agatha said, I also have kind of another focus where I work quite a lot with scientists and on interdisciplinary research projects. Another part of my kind of background, which I think feeds into what I'm going to say today, is that I used to also run a gallery. So I ran a project space in London for the best part of 8 or 9 years, and that was called Alma Enterprises between 2004 and 2012. And at that gallery, I showed a lot of different kind of media art focused projects, really. And I'll show you it and give you a glimpse of that in a minute. As Agatha said, I'm also the leader of the Digital Ecologies research group at Barspar, and I'll give you a sense of what we're looking at in the research group as I move through these slides. So a few examples of my work then. So Notes 1, 2, and 3 was a solo show back in 2010 in Spike Island, Bristol. One of the projects I've been working on with a scientist, Signal and the Noise, was a project I worked on in Cambridge with Darren Logan, looking at genetics, looking at genomes, and thinking about the connections between computer coding and genetic coding. A project I'm working on right now is called Hyperempathy Machines, and that's working with composer and sound artist Owen Lloyd from the Royal Welsh College of Music, and we're really looking at how we can create machines and generative audiovisual material that takes its basis from non-human life forms, including fungi and including microbial life forms like bacteria. So quite a few kind of recent projects I'm looking at. And then the Notes in the Subsurface one there is one I just did over 2020 and launched just before the kind of lockdowns, actually, with Bristol University. And that really looked at non-human life forms in the deep subsurface, working with a scientist there, Dr. Tom Williams, who was looking at things like bacteria, archaea, and thinking about what their kind of metabolisms and their functionality could mean for us as humans in the future, living underground, maybe in kind of deep subsurface communities. So a kind of sci-fi infused film with quite a critical edge to it, really thinking about climate change and where we're going. So a little bit of my background there. In terms of the gallery that I mentioned, I just wanted to highlight that I think in many ways that feeds into what I've ended up doing with the journal, the International Journal of Creative Media Research, and also kind of my way of thinking about practice-based research. So running this gallery over nearly 10 years was a really kind of interesting project, and as one of the co-curators, we worked with a really diverse set of artists. People like Suzanne Treister, when she did a residency there back in 2010, making her project military training based, as well as artists like Brian Catling, who did a kind of durational performance a few times in the gallery over a number of weeks. So all of this kind of background has really fed into where I'm going with the journal, and also a new platform that I'll mention at the end. In terms of our research group at Bar, I'll just kind of introduce you to it, because it will kind of connect quite closely to the Fiction Machines project that I talk about later on. So the group itself aims to develop practice-based research, and we interrogate the environmental, social, and political conditions of contemporary digital technologies and cultures. We work with members who are interrogating new technologies in innovative and experimental ways, particularly through their cutting-edge practice-based research. And we try and foster collaborations, and we've developed a whole series of symposia, as well as workshops and some exhibitions. So I don't want to dwell too much on this, but just a few examples then. So the Digital Ecologies and the Anthropocene Symposium back in 2017 was one of the first symposiums we developed. And that explored the links between digital technologies, their materials, their waste, their e-waste, and so on, and how they contributed to the Anthropocene. And that brought together a really interdisciplinary set of researchers from science, from art practice, as well as performers and poets. A whole range of people presented their work. And then that kind of fed into a journal special issue of Screenworks. So Screenworks is another practice-based journal, and I'm going to talk about Screenworks a little bit in a minute, and kind of from my experience of co-editing a practice-based journal off the back of that symposium. Another one is Fiction Machines. I'll talk about that later on. Again, a similar kind of format, quite an experimental format for a symposium that fed into other projects. We also did a whole series of public engagement events that were linked to some of our research clusters like Digital Ecologies, and that kind of drew out the research to the wider audience. And we co-hosted some talks as well, for example, with UC Purika. So that's Digital Ecologies. So now I would like to move into what I'm thinking about today, of course, for the focus of today's session. So the question really of defining practice-based research within an academic environment still feels quite blurry, with a myriad of definitions and approaches that have been applied to the structure of practice-based PhDs, for example. And of course, many artists and creative practitioners would argue that research and reflective practical inquiry has always been central to how they develop their work. Across institutions, we can see an explosion of practice-based research PhDs, and also a wide variety of interpretations of what these are, from those that kind of closely mirror a traditional PhD format, with the practice operating more as an insert or a footnote, to those that operate within the terms of the practice and aim to challenge the traditional format of the PhD itself. And in fact, these varying definitions and approaches are well illustrated in the formats of some of the practice-focused journals and platforms that I will discuss shortly. So starting then with one kind of quote from Candy and Edmonds, thinking about practice-based research, and really thinking about it as an approach that has yet to reach a settled status in terms of its definition and disclosure, despite its presence in academic contexts for over 35 years. So really kind of building on my initial point there, and then thinking a little bit now about where others have tried to define it. And I think that's quite useful when we think about how we might apply our practice to some of these journals that are out there. So Christopher Frayling, really worth considering briefly. So he talked about defining practice-based research and what it could mean for practitioners, and he discussed it back in 1993. And he was at the RCA then, and he considered the meaning of research for practitioners in his paper Research in Art and Design. And he basically said that he talked about two kind of definitions. So he thought about practice research through art and design. So that's material research or R&D into particular processes and technologies. So experiments with materials and processes in practice, what we might now term practice-led research. And then research for art and design, which he called the kind of thorny one, where questions are actually explored via the practice, maybe instead of a written thesis in a more standard PhD, for example, via the practice and a defined kind of research project where the thinking is embodied in the artifact along with a research reflective report. So Frayling also noted that at that time they did not award PhDs to students where the practice work speaks for itself, i.e. there's always a written element. And here we could argue that we've slightly moved on since then. For example, we have submissions that maybe use a whole series of essay films rather than much of the thesis, as well as more experimental submissions that we might see in some art schools, which really operate in the terms of the art practice and reinvent the PhD format itself. So a couple of kind of simple definitions then here. So practice-based research, think of it as an original investigation in order to gain new knowledge using practice. So using practice to answer our questions. Or practice-led research, thinking about the nature of practice, making new discoveries about practice and techniques of practice and so on, materials as well. So closely kind of linked to Frayling's original definitions there. But obviously in both of these cases, some contextualization tends to be needed in order to clarify where this new knowledge is being generated. And I think that's a key thing to keep in mind when we start looking at requirements for the journal examples that I'm going to look at. So I couldn't really do the session without mentioning REF. Okay, so it's only this one slide, in fact, where I'm really going to focus on REF for just a moment. But I think it's useful. We did something related to this talk a couple of years ago at Bar when we were thinking about practice-based journals. So it's kind of fed into what I'm doing today. And back then we were flagging up this kind of point from the 2014 report for Panel D. And essentially, it was really highlighting that there was still work to do in terms of distinguishing advanced practice as research and practice-based work that fulfill the definition of research, the way we frame it, the way we present it as research, the way we submit it for REF. So really maybe working with things like practice research journals might be a useful way of helping us to do that. And of course, REF is still judging this work, this research, using quite traditional terms. And it's useful as researchers, if we want to be submitted for REF, to keep that in mind. So of course, they're looking at things like originality, significance, and rigor. Okay, so you'll see that in the examples that I give later on, many of them are also using these same terms to evaluate and judge the submissions. So a few points here of why it might be worth then publishing for practice-based journals. So publishing in creative practice is definitely a useful way of contextualizing it, and that's one kind of key point, I think, exposing it to a wider audience as well. Because I think, as Agatha kind of mentioned, it's great to be working on the research through practice, but you really need to get it out to a wider audience and get that feedback via kind of peer evaluation is very useful. There's also an increasing availability of opportunities now and formats, and we'll cover just a few of them today. Of course, it's a useful way to prepare for REF as well. So just by kind of going through this process with the work, it prepares you and tightens up the work for REF submission. And it's also important to carefully consider the audience that you're interested in here. So as the research dimensions and aims of the work, think about how it might also map to some of the more traditional requirements of both academic journals and also REF itself. It's also useful to kind of focus on works that have a research dimension. And I think that's an important thing to say, because we can encounter certain works that we might have made as artists and practitioners that are quite difficult to frame within the terms of REF, or actually in the terms of some of the journals that I will look at. So work that really has research dimensions will be easier to work with, to submit and work with some of these journals. And then you can work with it in a rigorous and kind of critical way that's well informed contextually. let's look at a few examples then. So I'm going to look at kind of two quite diverse examples, I think. So coming from different approaches here, really. So the first one that I want to look at is Screenworks. And that's the journal that's run by UWE, Digital Cultures Research Centre in Bristol. And it's the one that I mentioned earlier on that I edited a special issue for. I co-edited a special issue for. And then I'll move on to look at the Journal for Artistic Research, which positions itself across a broad range of practice research, but takes a very experimental approach to how you actually submit a piece of work for peer review. And we'll go into that in a minute. So let's talk a little bit about Screenworks then. So what does Screenworks do? So they accept submissions on a rolling basis, as well as for special issues. The unique thing about Screenworks is that the work is subject to academic peer review, just as a standard academic journal article would be. And this provides a kind of evidence of the impact, significance, originality, and rigor of the practice's research. So a lot of the content that you'll see on Screenworks is film-based. So that's a kind of obviously a key focus here. So film-based practice research. They also operate an open single blind review policy. So where anonymous peer reviewers are published alongside the research statements. So I think that's quite an interesting one. So you don't really see so many examples of that. So everything becomes very transparent. So as well as your completed article that has gone through peer review alongside your practice, you'll also see elements of that peer review feedback. And I can show you that later on. So there's an intention here to create a kind of supportive yet rigorous environment, and this is what they talk about on their website for the academic community, researching screen-based media through practice, whilst at the same time helping them to engage with wider audiences. So let's kind of look at an example then, okay, of a kind of a particular issue. So this is volume 8.2, and this is the one that evolved out of the original symposium from Barspar. So digital ecologies and the Anthropocene. So it was a kind of collaboration with the Screenworks associate editor Alex Neville, myself, and Joshua McNamara from University of Melbourne. So yeah, so we had around 6 pieces here, and I will, if possible, stop sharing and just show you an example. So. Everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so here we go. So in terms of Screenworks, I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the requirements for it, but just to give you an example of how it kind of materializes, let's just show you an article in it. So here you have the introduction from the editors for the special issue. We had quite a range of works which kind of mapped to some of the strands from the conference. And then if we actually go into the work itself, and I'm going to look here at Adam Fisher's documentary Point of Presence, you can see the embedded work, so we can just watch a tiny bit. Okay, so I'll let you kind of watch that in your own time, because it's not the best way to show a video at all. But yeah, just giving you a sense. So they tend to embed the film work at the top, and then you have your research statement. And this research statement then goes through the peer review process. Okay, so in the statement, you'll notice that there's certain headings that you have to fulfill. So you have to talk about the research questions, how they evolved, how they kind of then fed into further questions, etc. You have to provide context for the work, so a contextual statement of the theory and relevant histories that are surrounding the development of this research that evolved into the film work. And then talking about your methods in terms of, as well as the outcomes and the dissemination. So quite a short statement here, along with references. And you'll see underneath, you have all of the peer reviews, so elements of them, actually a summary. So you'll see what the peer reviewer said about the particular work. Okay. So when you submit for ScreenWorks, you'll need to fill in a form that has those kind of headings, and you submit your response to all of those headings in response to the work you're sending. So let me just go back to my slides. So here's kind of their call for papers. So we invite submissions of moving image work on film, video, and new media platforms. We feel strongly that the function of ScreenWorks is to provide an opportunity for practice research to undergo the equivalent rigorous peer review process to that of the traditional publication, and fully understand contributors' need to evidence the impact and significance of their practice as research. So in terms of those statements that you need to submit, they are up to 2,000 words, okay? And you'll see if you have a look through examples there, there's slightly different takes from those that have been through the process on how they respond to the required statements. But essentially, you're talking about your research questions, your context, your methods, your outcomes, and your impact. So very closely matching actually some of those kind of key criteria of REF actually in the way that you're publishing here. So something to keep in mind. And I think one key thing to pull out of this as well is this idea of the route map. So rather than just a statement that explains the work, kind of backs it up, you're actually giving a route map through the research process. Okay. And this is kind of one way, I think, of evidencing the kind of the strategy, the approach that you've used to develop the practice research, as well as, of course, talking about the dissemination process, the wider impacts, where it's being shown, etc. And this kind of idea of the route map, I think, is very interesting because it's something that the Journal of Artistic Research specifically kind of takes it very far from kind of more of a standard statement to something that's very different. So let's just have a little look now at the Journal of Artistic Research then. So if you haven't encountered this before, I'll just give you a kind of summary of how they describe themselves. So JAR is an international online open access and peer-reviewed journal that disseminates artists' research from all disciplines. It serves as a meeting point of diverse practices and methodologies. So it provides a digital platform where multiple methods, media, and articulations may function together to generate insights in artistic practice research endeavors. It seeks to promote expositions of practice as research, and it asks you actually to work with something with their own platform. Okay, so they've got their own platform that's called the Research Catalog, and actually that is what you build your submission in. And this allows you to build experimental route maps through the practice research in a very kind of non-standard way compared to some of the previous example. So in order for authors to actually be considered for peer review, they have to basically log into the Research Catalog, set up an account, and construct the entire research map. And then the board will consider whether the exposition exposes the artistic practice as research. And this goes beyond simply documenting, describing, or writing about work. It engages with questions and claims about knowledge within practice. and the degree to which the exposition is conceptually and artistically strong, considered and significant to the field. So whether the multimedia and design capabilities of the research catalogue platform itself have been used effectively and meaningfully to support the argument or understanding of the research. So they encourage unorthodox or ambiguous approaches to writing and design. So the more kind of experimental end then of practice research. So just a few examples here, and then I'll kind of dive into the actual live version of this in a second, just to give you a sense of kind of how these might manifest. Okay, so we can see one project here called Play by Matilda Merriles and Diogo Alvim, and this one operates in the way they've mapped it out very much like a route map. That's visual. It's where the practice itself joins with the kind of map through the methods. So it becomes also a different way of showcasing the practice-based work. Another example here, which is Jim Lloyd's work in JAR 25, so Future Earth Scream Now, the Sol Rasol Birdsong Translator. Again, as you can see, this starts looking like something very different to a kind of standard, more standard kind of journal article or research statement. Let's just have a look again at the live version. Cool. Okay, so I'll just walk you through an example of the Jim Lloyd piece. Give you a sense of one take on it, but of course every single piece you'll see on this, and it's really worth looking at JAR and having a look through some of the examples, has been constructed in a different way, and there's flexibility in the research catalogue platform that lets you do that. So yeah, so here, I would say this is the most kind of, this is the point where there's kind of more standard writing, and this is not the case in every single submission, but this one has got a kind of introduction that gives it some context and aims to the project. And as you can see in this particular example, I'm able to navigate through it in a kind of horizontal way, moving to the next sections as I go along.
International Dawn Chorus Day. Sing apoplexy scratch paradise to balance. Inject intrigue greening the church scream and fabric complacent vocalize ivory shrouds. Smoke presence to scratch solve monotony and deal the river your perfection's first toil. Shroud smoke presence to scratch solve monotony and deal river your perfection's first toil. Equitation to glorify lace crucifix. Shroud smoke presence.
So yeah, so what I think, and this is obviously a really interesting project and something that you need some time to kind of walk through this kind of route map through it. But whilst there's obviously in this particular example some context and methods in that early section, what we are taking on is we're taking inside the practice, and I think that's kind of really interesting through all the iterations of the research itself to kind of a new iteration of the practice that's joined up with its route map, joined up with its methods, in a kind of experimental online display mode. And so something that I think also particularly works for certain research projects. Okay, let me just go back to my slides. Okay, so for us, responding then to the need for more practice-based journals, and in kind of light of those two examples that I showed you there, we were really interested at Bar in thinking about how we could develop a kind of platform for outputting practice-based research. One as a way of also helping our colleagues to disseminate their work, as well as colleagues across the globe, essentially. And we were really keen then to develop this platform, obviously in light of the fact there aren't actually at this point still many opportunities, many platforms to disseminate this form of research. So the interesting thing, I guess, was that the initial idea for this was spanned a few years back now, when we were in early kind of discussions around REF with one of our evaluators. And we talked about the fact we had lots of colleagues making practice and practice submissions. And he was actually suggested to us that why didn't we think about developing our own platform, maybe our own practice-focused journal. And that was the spark of the idea that then a couple of years later fruitioned into this journal launching online. For me as well, it was really kind of interesting curatorially to think about ways of working with practice-based research that might be kind of experimental, that might find new avenues for it, that might get it out there in slightly non-standard ways compared to some of the more standard academic formats. Also providing a platform for researchers to publish and develop practice research and receive peer review feedback in a critical way in order to evolve it. So the publication itself, International Journal of Creative Media Research, is an interdisciplinary and peer-reviewed and open access academic journal. And we're devoted to pushing forward the approaches and possibilities of publishing creative media-based research. So we champion artistic experimentation alongside critical rigor, creative reflection, and we specialize in capturing the emerging tools and approaches and methods of practice-based media arts research particularly. So we publish original screen-based, sound-based and experimental forms of creative research and digital works across film, music, media art, digital writing, curatorial practice, and multi-platform practice. So quite a broad range of works if you look through some of the issues that we've had to date. So here is just a screenshot of the front cover. Do have a look at it in your own time as well. So we've had a number of issues to date. And the way we publish this particular journal is that we have an open policy. So we have open submissions for papers, for submissions for pieces of work that is rolling, ongoing. And we also have special issues where we have an invited editor or someone who's made a proposal, edit a special issue with 6 to 10 pieces in it. Okay. We also have an editorial board that we set up for the journal. It's quite a diverse editorial board that allow us to map different research interests to different types of submissions across the range of works that I kind of introduced just now. So we have artists, we have scholars, we have writers, musicians, performers, technologists, designers, filmmakers, and educators. And this is kind of growing network depending on the sorts of submissions and special issues that we develop. So I just wanted to say a little bit about some of the formats that we've been working with. And in terms of formats, this is kind of an ongoing discussion. Myself and Matt and Agatha and others have been talking about this and thinking about other ways of evolving this as we go forward. So one of the initial formats that we came up with was the single piece exploration. So that's more similar maybe to the structure of the Screenworks example that I showed. So up to 2,000 words. And we asked for research questions. We asked you to talk about the methodology and provide some critical context to the work and some evidence of significance, so the dissemination of the work. And if you look at the journal right now, have a look online, you'll see quite a few examples that are focused on single piece explorations. So as well as the statement, we'll also be showing, of course, the work on the website that the journal lives on. And of course, in line with REF criteria, this research statement does quite a good job of helping you to formulate a context and statement for the work that then can be used for REF as well. Another format that we've been working on, and again, this is quite a useful format, and this format maybe is a little bit more like the one I just looked at from JAR, but of course we are not using a kind of, we haven't got our own platform where you can make a kind of experimental submission. We're asking you to submit multi-piece submissions, so a whole set of works that join together as an exploration of a number of research questions. So you'll see again a few examples of this in each issue. and really this is a route map through the research. Okay, so we ask the artist to submit a route map through the practice, talking about their research questions, looking at particular works that began the exploration and then informed further works, further events, discussions, exhibitions, and so on. So a really nice way of framing a whole set of practice-based research. And then, of course, also this maps really nicely as well to REF submissions in terms of multi-piece REF submissions. We also have some other formats as well. So a longer format for 6,000 words on a practice-led or practice-based discovery, as we call it. So a much more substantial written piece. So quite a lot of flexibility there. And we're also thinking of other formats currently. So just to give you an example then of one of the issues. So I thought I'd kind of showcase the special issue that I was the co-editor of, to just give you a sense of it. So I worked with a couple of colleagues from different universities, Dr. Tony D. Sampson from UEL and Dr. Andy Weir from Bournemouth, Arts University Bournemouth. So this came out of the symposium that we ran, and we had an open call for papers at that symposium. And then some of those people at the symposium and a wider set of submitters responded and went through the peer review process. So let's just have a sense of how this journal manifests. Okay, great. So yeah, so here we are. So it's I think quite a nice format that we have here. So yeah, so we have this section here, which is of course the introduction from the editors to the particular theme of this special issue, and then we have all of the pieces, and these pieces vary in being multi-piece portfolio submissions, such as this one here, Noise of Becoming, to single piece explorations. So here's quite a nice example, I think. So here's the format. So all of these have their own DOI, so like a kind of standard format, the standard number that you have for any kind of journal article. And then we have our research statements and the showing of the works. And again, this is a research statement for a single piece, this particular example, that's talking through this particular project, which thinks of the network access point in Miami as a form of fiction machine, tying in the theme of the symposium and the special issue. So I suppose, unlike Screenworks, we don't kind of visually showcase what the peer reviewers have said. That's kind of kept behind the scenes, but they all do go through that review process. And we have a kind of content management system that runs behind this journal that allows us to do that. And I suppose another thing to say is that we really don't just focus on moving image works, we focus on quite a range of media art focused works here. So you'll see some videos and you'll see all sorts of other things. Experimental online works like this one here, After Humanity, by Garfield Benjamin. A whole series of performance works in this example here. And a VR installation in this one at the top here, The Language and a Meme Economy. And then going down here, a film work. Okay, so yeah, so that just gives you a sense of it. So far, we've published around, let's see, so we've published around 7 issues, and we have a number more planned for this year. We're also kind of expanding out into other areas of this with some additional theme sections. And if you actually wanted to submit, do submit here. You can submit to the kind of rolling open call for papers, or respond to one of the theme-based issues, or indeed think about if you would like to propose a special issue to us. In terms of the editorial board, quite a broad range of international editors on the editorial board who we can access to help us with that peer review process. Great. Okay, so let me just go back to my slides. Cool. Great, okay. So a few further examples then. So beyond the more standard journal, we can there's a few examples that I think are worth considering. So here's a project called Project Anywhere. And in fact, a colleague of mine at Bath Spa is one of the kind of people that are involved in running this. And so that's how I came across it. So Project Anywhere is a global exhibition program for art at the kind of outermost limits of location specificity. So they use a double-blind peer review model instead of a curator. And it provides artists and artist researchers working outside traditional exhibition systems with peer validation, community support, and global dissemination of their work. So quite an interesting platform here, and somewhat different to the kind of examples that we've looked at so far. So it's really very much focused on the practice-based submission of the work rather than written context, etc. And this work then goes through that peer review process. One more example then. And so this is an example, and I think there's loads of kind of examples that have kind of, it's particularly emerged during the lockdown and the pandemic. So lots of different ways of curating practice-based work online. More Than Ponies is similar to a number of others, but I think More Than Ponies is a nice example here, where they have some funding and they essentially commission artists to do online projects on their platform. There's a very short statement about the work, but the focus here is on these newly commissioned projects. And this is one by artist Jeanette Thomas, who's someone that was also part of some of our symposia at Bath Spa, who made a brand new film as part of her commission in 2020 during the lockdown, and then it's been published here on More Than Ponies. So yeah, so I think if you start looking around, you'll see that there's a lot of different sorts of online publications for practice-based work that have really emerged quite recently. So for the final kind of section of this, I really kind of just wanted to focus in then on a project of mine and think about how I kind of evolved it via a small piece of practice research, as I said at the start. So what is this project? So Fiction Machines itself is a multi-component research project. So it's comprises of a body of video artworks, a journal article, a curated symposium, and a journal special issue. And it's still kind of ongoing. So there's other elements of it that I'm still working with. So the research for this project considered how media artworks can be developed that expose, rewrite, and critique the mechanisms of contemporary control technologies from informational and effective perspectives. And secondly, how reappropriation can be used to harness source material drawn from the operations of these technologies. And then thirdly, it thought about how the works themselves could become forms of self-reflexive machine. So performing effective control on the viewer that is standing in front of them or viewing them online, whilst also exposing their artifice. And then fourthly, building on kind of the works themselves, thinking about how similar research approaches that harness fiction to rethink technologies can be interrogated and brought into view. So a number of areas of exploration there. And of course, the way that I particularly have of working does map quite well to some of these models of practice-based research that I've kind of been looking at, and the examples of some of these journals and how they require you to kind of shape your practice submissions. So here is the initial film that started this project, and I guess I'm trying to illustrate here that maybe just starting with one piece of research can be a useful way to then build a whole set of interlinked research practice. So this film, Opor Ravak, made back in 2016, taking the language of data recovery to extreme levels by manipulating both digital and non-digital materials via its sentient interface an apparent ability to control all things human and non-human. So really playing around with the idea of data recovery here. So this was a 4-minute film that I made, showed it at quite a few different kind of festivals and galleries, places like the WRO Media Art Biennale in Poland, as well as One Contra International in Berlin. And from this, I built out other things, but I began actually by creating a number of other works that kind of explored that initial question further that I kind of went through just now. So here is one example then. So this is so the film on the left, Implex, kind of took some of these ideas of these kind of self-reflexive video machines and took that a little bit further. So this one addresses the kind of current additions by approaching the language of behavioral marketing to propose a machine that enables a new form of responsive solution. So it appears to be a form of kind of sentient real-time software that uses neural monitoring, data analysis, video effects, and effective tactics to respond to its users' needs. And then from here, then I built a number of other works that kind of took different angles to respond to the initial question. And then these then kind of fed into an exploration of other practices that were doing something similar. And for me, this is such a useful step in the kind of project, essentially. So I moved from just looking through my practice to creating a journal article about some of the videos, and then actually curating an experimental symposium called Fiction Machines. So this symposium then took place at Bath Spa back in July 2019. And I worked really here with a number of artists and researchers and had some really interesting keynote speakers. And I wanted to open up here discussions around kind of speculative fiction as a strategy in art practice. So something that was quite key in the construction of these video works. So I developed this symposium along with a number of strands for that symposium. So those strands included design fictions, they included non-human fictions, activist fictions, and post-truth fictions. And some really interesting keynote speakers, Simon O'Sullivan from Goldsmiths, and also Tony David Sampson from UEL. And all of the kind of participants brought some really kind of different approaches to those different research strands that we looked at, and also different approaches to presenting conference papers. So we did have some standard conference papers, but we also had lots of things that were much more around being live performances. So for example, in the bottom left corner there, you can see Amy Clark doing a live performance in one of our kind of mini cinemas at the university. You can see Andy Weir and Harry Meadows in the top right corner there doing a live performance that responds to sound and video and environmental sensors. So in this way, I felt that the symposium really kind of moved forward that kind of experimental format of disseminating practice-based research, and it kind of then evolved into becoming a journal special issue. Okay, and that was the one that I kind of was just kind of showing you very briefly just now. And what I quite like to do with the research projects is to keep on kind of building on them. So whilst we kind of advertised the call for papers at that symposium, we then obviously advertised that to a wider audience as well. So we had lots of other different artists and researchers responding to this special issue. And I ran that with Andy Weir and Tony, and we selected further pieces of research that went through the peer review process and then got published. And then in terms of keeping on building on a project, so keeping on interrogating it and building a network and kind of pushing that research out there in different ways. Back in then 2021, we took that kind of another stage further. So it was kind of a revisit with all of the kind of contributors to the special issue, kind of around 6 or 7 months later. And instead of everyone just kind of presenting what they published in the special issue, they all presented brand new projects, brand new research in an experimental format for an online 3-hour event. And actually, whilst it was quite a challenging event to make work on Zoom, it did work really well. And it's kind of led me to think about doing further projects off the back of this. So now working on an exhibition proposal with some of the people from all of the different iterations of this, as well as maybe an edited book related to it. So really, just really wanted to illustrate here this project that all started with essentially one video work and blossomed out from there. And of course, there is a ref point to this as well. So that project also then turned into a multi-component ref output, okay? And all of those kind of activities and areas of practice then kind of joined together in a really useful way for the ref submission that I created for REF 2021. So one of my submissions is a kind of multi-piece portfolio submission. And I think a kind of important thing for me to kind of say to finish with then is that I feel that you don't need to compromise on your practice to kind of operate within the academic realm, or to publish it, or to connect with new networks and new audiences. I think it's just really important that where you go with it comes out of the essence of your research, your focus, and the practice that you're creating. And you can ensure that it's rigorous. You can ensure that it kind of keeps on evolving and keeps on developing networks and so on. And one thing that I just wanted to kind of finish with was that we're thinking about actually for the Digital Ecologies Research Group developing an additional platform actually that is really about experimental curatorial practice. So it kind of evolves a bit from being a research journal to being something that's really all about curating practice-based works with particular themes and having discussions around that. So that's kind of where I'm going with the research group. However, I think it's probably time for me to stop and we can have a discussion, because I've been talking for a long time just at my screen. So it'll be good to turn that off. There we go. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. Hopefully that's been useful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Charlie. That was really, really inspiring, I have to say. And I have lots of questions myself. I'm gonna start with my opening question and just let's try to see how we can balance the time we have between everyone else's question. And what I'd like to say first, what really inspired me is your approach with the Fiction Machines project, because what you talk about there really addresses the problem I always had. So I come, like you, I come from this kind of very artistic background, and for many, many years, what I was doing is just, you know, having exhibitions or showing my films at more artistic venues, or just thinking about my practice, even though it was already touching what I started doing as a researcher. I was just always looking at it. Oh, well, this is my creative practice. That belongs to the gallery space. That belongs to the film festival. And then obviously you start publishing, so there's expectations, you know, publish or perish. You have to look at quality journals, you have to produce quality papers. And obviously we have what we talked about here today, really, really beautiful places. We kind of bring these two things together. But for many years, these three things almost function in my mind in certain separation, even though the last case is almost, as I said, kind of put together. But I always thought, well, what kind of audiences are we addressing in this case? Because obviously, if you think about these three different venues, your work will be effectively read or watched or listened to by very, very different kind of people. And what you talk about in your example is just really beautiful, because this idea of building on your project and just creating almost a collection of outputs which can address all these different elements is just really, really a fantastic way of thinking about it, which I never really kind of thought about myself. So I guess the question is just to kind of bring it back, and I'm sorry if it's a difficult question, but how do you determine where is the right venue, where is the right place for you to disseminate your work in the first place, and how do you determine what this balance between the written word, which we said it really is essential in one way or another, you just cannot really get away without it, and your practice, because again, these different venues we discussed will have a different balance between your practice and your written word. So how do you determine where is the right place to go in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, isn't it? And it's interesting, isn't it, thinking actually about some of those symposiums that I just mentioned that we'd organised, you know, and the Fiction Machines one's a good example. So I remember inviting certain people to it who are artists who said that they'd never really presented in an academic symposium before, and they were a little bit nervous about it. And so it took quite a lot of encouragement to say that actually you can present a very non-standard response. You can do a performance, you can do something that just throws the kind of standard paper in the bin. That's okay for this particular event. And I've definitely also had people in the past who I've invited who have basically just said, I'm an artist and I do not want to be part of this, actually. So they've got a nervousness about academia, and we can all understand that. I think I kind of come from both of those perspectives sometimes, because my background when I was curating a gallery, I was not involved that much in academia at that particular point. So how do you determine the right place for it? And I think that's something that also comes up a lot in REF, doesn't it? When you're trying to help colleagues think about how to almost make their submission, make it right, make it. And I think the key learning for me is that it really, really depends on the project. And it's like PhDs as well. It really depends on what the project is, the research. So it has to come from that project. Otherwise, you're going to run into huge problems. So if I've got a particular project that I've been doing, and I've got an ambition to present it in JAR, for example, the Journal of Artistic Research, I would suggest people think very carefully about that, about if that project is going to map to that kind of requirement of JAR. Because if you've got an experimental project that's got lots of strands and could map like that, that could work really well. However, if you've got one film that's a really strong piece of research, it might not, actually. It might be really, very difficult. You really need to unpack the whole film and think about how you used it and how you developed it in terms of methods and so on. So I think you have to be really honest about what the research project actually is, and then think about how it could map to some of these different platforms. Maybe also you encounter colleagues who are artists, actually, and they have work that is their practice that they make on a daily basis, and they have more complex research projects that map more accurately to some of these platforms. So again, think about which element of your work might be the best to submit. And then some of it might be just work that you want to show in a gallery and you don't really want to present in such an academic context, So I think there's, and that's also fine. And some of those kind of online, more curatorial platforms might be the way to go for that, So there's also a thing about ambition, isn't there, as well? So where do you want to position yourself as an academic, as an artist? Do you want to position yourself as a person that will be in REF, that will be submitted? Or do you want to actually just get your practice out there? These are questions that I think you have to be honest and answer. If you want to position yourself in REF, then it's worth thinking about journals that I've talked about, like Screenworks, like our journal, like JAR, thinking about how your practice might operate in it, or actually starting a project that you feel you could practice, you could publish in one of them as one of the outputs, so maybe initiating a research project that is not just about your own personal practice, but is going somewhere else with questions and so on. So I think the worst problem that you can run into with REF, right, is when you feel that you're slightly backwards engineering projects to make them fit into the requirements of REF. And I think that can also happen with these journals. You're slightly backwards engineering a project that you've completed to try and fit it in. So the more it's actually been set up in a research format, the better it will be suited for those types of online practice journals. Yeah. Is that kind of answering it?
Yeah, no, it is. It's fascinating. And, I think another thing which came to my mind as you were talking about it is that obviously the nature, as you rightly said, all the projects will be different. And I think the fascinating and at the same time challenging thing about practice-based research is not only because many of us will sit in between this kind of creative and academic side of it, but also by the nature of what we're doing, we are very interdisciplinary. So, for example, I found myself writing about my film in the context of anthropology, but obviously I'm not anthropologist, but because my film was kind of close to that, and I realized I was writing quite a lot about my film, and then I asked myself a question: why am I actually writing so much about the film when the purpose of what I'm doing is actually to show the film rather than just write so much about it? So I think it's really interesting, and I think these decisions are much more complex than if you were working in, let's say, history, because then it's really straightforward. You just write the paper in a journal which is relevant to your field, and you have it easy. So I think, again, the emergence of all these platforms, such as, all the things you mentioned, including our journals, is just really, really promising, in my opinion, because it kind of positions us in this kind of in-betweenness, and it does address this idea of being in between both disciplines, but also in between a creative and artistic world. So I think it's really, really interesting. I would love to overtake this question time, but I think it's probably a good idea. I stop for a second and let's just see if there's anyone in the public. It's really nice because Jackie, who's smiling lovely here, is going to be talking about REF and impact case studies in relation to practice base in the next session. So I can see that you have your hand up, Jackie. I don't know if you'd like to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say what a fabulous presentation it was, and I thought it was really excellent. And I wasn't aware of all these different possibilities for practice-based researchers to publish, and I really like the way that it enables people, like you said, sort of not to compromise on what they're doing, not to try and fit square pegs into round holes, but actually try and, you know, find somewhere that's going to be a welcome part of their practice. And you know, which is excellent. And from my point of view, you know, I quite often have these conversations about publishing, partly because of the impact case studies and the fact that although they can be based on practice-based research, that it is more challenging to demonstrate the quality of it when, you know, if it's not published. So that's another kind of rationale in a way to you know, for somebody who does have those kind of ambitions to follow up the opportunities. So I think the only question I had was that you mentioned about the for the IJCMP about the portfolios kind of follow the REF format. Does that kind of literally mean that if you've developed a portfolio for REF, then potentially that could be published with little or no sort of change to how it is? Or because some of those are kind of fantastic productions that it'd be great to think that they could be shared more widely. So I wondered if that was what you meant or whether I'd misunderstood.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. That's exactly what I meant. Yeah, so that kind of format, the multi-piece one. Yeah, so that's kind of where we came up with it. So yeah, so I think we've got examples of colleagues that have kind of used it actually and have published on there, and then that's gone into their REF submission essentially. So yeah, so I think I would encourage people who have submitted a multi-piece portfolio for REF to think about then submitting it as an article, and linking up all those sections, because they've pretty much got the material they would need to fulfill that actually.
I think that would be a fabulous opportunity. I'm certainly going to be encouraging colleagues to do that, because you know they are, you know, wonderful pieces of work, so many of those, and it would be really good to, you know, to be able to sort of, having put all that work into developing it, to be able to share it more widely. I'm sure that, you know, that would be a welcome opportunity for many people. So I shall certainly be mentioning that and encouraging people. So thank you. That's really inspiring and encouraging. Thank you, Charlie.
Great.
Jess, I think you have a hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. That was really quite eye-opening. I'm very interested in your multifaceted life, from starting off as, and I don't know if that's the right, that's not being rude, it is really interesting, and you know, but you know, having been a curator and being an artist, and now an academic and a publisher, do you feel that you've reached a point where you have bridged the schism between all these things, or is there still more places to fall down in between the cracks?
I've certainly not joined it all together. No, I think there's lots of places. You know, especially, you know, well, you know, the HE environment is challenging, should we say? So I still think there's other places. You know, there's still really room for many more things like experimental project spaces and even you know, even project spaces that become slightly funded by universities. Maybe I think that would you know, I think that's maybe bridging the schism, isn't it, a bit more actually, between something like our journal, some other ideas around kind of dissemination platforms, and then actually real world kind of things, because, you know, I'm just thinking about where I am in Bristol here and the distinct lack of art spaces actually for such a creative city, and it's really surprising. And I think everyone that lives here that operates in kind of any kind of practice, research and art is always kind of moaning about that and complaining the whole time, in fact. So so I think there's space actually for universities that you know, have practice focused courses and research to maybe take a step out of the institution into their surrounding city, and for quite low amounts of money help some of these really, you know, diverse kind of curators who are often quite young and don't have any money set up spaces. That was something that would connect the schism for me with my background as well, in someone that literally set up a gallery that, you know, we got the space for free because we were part of a kind of charitable organization, but, you know, put our own money into it, built the walls ourselves, spent our weekends building the wall, all of that kind of stuff. So very hands-on. And I really think there's a problem there, because a lot of these kind of spaces all disappear generally after 2 years actually. So it was an achievement for us to keep going for like 8 or 9 years. So I think it's also a place, isn't it, for practice-based researchers to then operate. So maybe these spaces could be co-run with practice-based researchers and curators who are operating outside. And of course there are some examples around of that in action, but I think there should be more of that. And I think that's a way for sustaining things and sustaining students and practice researchers. Maybe I haven't answered your question. That's just something that came into my mind. But yeah, that for me, there's still work to do. And I'm often thinking of setting up another space often, but I haven't done it because I haven't got any time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, Jackie's saying that one of our colleagues, Associate Professor Anna Francis, is a director of Airspace Gallery in Stoke-on-Trent. Yes, absolutely. And what I wanted to say again in relation to what you mentioned, I think despite all the challenges, I think we're really lucky in terms of where we are in a kind of history of academia, if you like, that there is obviously more and more recognition. Despite all the problems, we still have to kind of recognize this kind of unconventional type of research. But we have more and more, slowly we're getting more and more recognition and opportunities and potentially funding, and obviously the platforms we discussed today. But of course, there will be still people who say, well, no, you just need to look into traditional, publishing, and this is really what you need. What do you think we can do collectively as people working with practice-based to bring even more recognition for practice-based research and the kind of venues for disseminating it? I'm sorry, I'm asking you very difficult questions today.
Well, I think doing more things like this, Agatha, I think is really important. Like your whole series of events. I think that's really important, isn't it? So yeah, absolutely, well done on that. Well, it feels like we need to join up more with other practice researchers, I think, because there's a lot of problems that people are encountering still of kind of connecting the work and showing the work and so on. And we need more platforms and ways of showing it. I think that's kind of the key. Maybe, yeah, also thinking about ways of making some of that research more rigorous. I mean, there's such a diversity of practice-based research that it can be quite problematic. And there's a lot of artists working with scientists now as well. So there's that whole area, and I've kind of dipped my toe into that quite a lot. And that's a myriad of complexities, that kind of area as well, because you'll get artists that are working with scientists who want to publish the work, and one way to go is to put it in a scientific journal as a kind of sci-art project, but often with a different emphasis than we would maybe like from the creative research side. And there's often an emphasis of artists kind of visualizing scientific data, maybe, kind of on the worst side of that kind of area. So there's lots of things to kind of do in some of these fields, I think. So I think, yeah, I think we need to kind of evolve it further. I feel there's like such a diversity of approaches to practice research PhDs as well. And I'm not sure everyone's aware of it, because almost every institution seems to have a different take. And in fact, every practice research project I've come across seems to have a slightly different take on what the practice is supposed to do. So it would be useful to have some clearer shared definitions. So I think actually bringing together colleagues involved in practice-based PhDs and practice research more would be really useful.
Yeah, funny you said that, because the whole idea behind this seminar was really just to, and we discussed it in another context, but is to just really think about what is the right type of support and building this toolkit for practice-based PhDs. And I'm sure Francisco is smiling there, because I think this is what we collectively missing a little bit. I think we do quite a lot in relation to that, but I don't think there's any structured way to approach this. And I think it would be really helpful for people working and supervising practice-based PhD to come together. And that's what I'm trying to work really hard on at the moment, to try to understand what this right path to do this is. And actually funny, because you said we talk a lot about interdisciplinary, and we had a really fascinating seminar session with Professor Carola Baum, who was talking about this idea of how interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary is as a term we use so often, but we also not very clear collectively what that actually means, and you know, it could be misunderstood and misinterpreted by so many people, and that's also very interesting. So it's really nice to have these conversations, and maybe at some point there will be more clarity through all these activities. Another thing I wanted to say about the platforms you discussed today, Charlie, is, and the reason I think they're so important is because, of course, everything is online today. So even traditional journals, they have their online websites, if you like, and there's some articles which you can access with open access, not all of them, though, which obviously is a problem. And then in theory, even if you publish your traditional article, you can include a link to your film or to your practice, but obviously that's not the same. And I think this is really very important to put into focus as well, that there's a very fundamental difference between a traditional journal, which has a website where you can put a link to your practice, or the platforms you discussed today, where the core idea is that you present your practice with obviously all the context which is required to really justify why this is a very rigorous research. But the focus is just in a very, very different place. And obviously this idea of being open access as well is absolutely fundamental, I think. And this is really what we didn't discuss today, but I think it is a very, very important element of what's happening. Would you agree?
You mean keeping everything open access?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I agree. And kind of just going back to what you were saying, I think, yeah, it feels like there's a lot of scope for kind of talking to lots of PhD supervisors and students to really do it's like a giant research project, really, isn't it? To do things like toolkit that you're talking about, but also, yeah, to really professionalize and make more rigorous approaches to practice research, because there's a lot of blurriness still there, isn't there? And I think there's lots of work to do in that area. And I think there's lots of you know, people who are having to supervise PhDs in also that just don't have anything to access to help, particularly with examples of really experimental approaches. And I've seen approaches at certain places that are deeply experimental submissions, and then approaches at the other end of the scale, like I said at the start. So where is all of that being captured? I don't really see those kind of examples in some of the kind of practice research books that I've read, you know. So
yeah, I think we just invented a new idea for a special issue, Charlie.
Yeah.
On supervising practice-based PhD, I think will be quite interesting. Is there any other question in the public? Does anyone else have any question or comment?
Just hi. I don't know if it's a question, maybe just a thought. Maybe we'd like to hear from you, Charlie. Because we're moving to this very exciting experimental approach to submit works. That's really exciting. Something for artistic practitioners is amazing, working for research. But on the other hand, you have institutions that are still, you know, grounded normatives and regulation that push you back to the traditional way to writing, you know, to write the thesis and dissertation, the right way to do that. Do you think one way can push each other? How it's in terms of structure, institution, like say, is those new approach to journals and new platforms can help to make change in the institution, or vice versa? How can those things can communicate? I think there's a kind of ocean of distance sometimes. Don't know.
So you talking about how they can contribute to kind of cultural change in institutions?
Institutions, yeah. I know that's a difficult question. I don't know. It's not really a question. It's just like
no. I mean, there needs to be a lot more work there. We were thinking about what other things need to be done, and of course, there does. Of course, lots of institutions will see your submissions as it's a lot more straightforward, isn't it, to write a more standard journal article and maybe use the practice as something that you're just writing about, maybe. So yeah, so I think it's a cultural thing for sure, and it seems strange that we've got all these practice-based researchers teaching now in HE, and all of these kind of many research students. But then when it comes to things like REF, we're expected to do more standard things often in many institutions. So yeah, I think we can contribute to that. I mean, I think it feels like there needs to be work done to bring it together, to give confidence in those kind of research, the heads of research in these institutions, as well as researchers themselves, that they can publish, get good reviews in REF and so on, you know. So, and that's where your academic career goes, isn't it? So yeah, there's loads of work to do, isn't there? And there's some of the, you know, we've just kind of touched on some of that today to flag up some routes to take. But yeah, I agree. Work to do. I mean, there's been moments when I thought, you know, I'm just going to write a standard article, you know, a few years ago, but then I kind of moved on from that. Luckily.
Good. Yeah, thank you.
Paul, this is fantastic. I was hoping that you can ask a question, Paul, but you have to go. It's great to see the creative online approaches to sharing the work, in particular the roadmaps of the project. So again, Paul is going to be talking about practice-based research in film in, I think, two months. So in one of the future. Oh, here you are. Hi.
I'm still here. I'll stay for a moment longer.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to say something in relation to?
I think, yeah, it's just coming in again from that approach of being a sort of practitioner first and then coming into academia much later. Seeing these approaches sort of really clears up a lot of the sort of issues I think that people coming from our sort of background have had with the idea of research and publishing research. And like I say, I think that the comment really is those roadmaps I think are fantastic for a lot of the projects that I would work on, because they happen over a long period of time. You know, there might be a year or a couple of years from where we start to where we finish, and the projects develop and change, and through that you can really show. We'll quite often disseminate work through really small local exhibitions where we're doing the creation of the work. We'll bring that work back to our local area. We'll share it at other universities at relative places. So I think that's a really interesting way of publishing. So that gives me confidence that I can kind of put the research work into that format that sort of REF needs. I think that's the real advantage I think that I've seen from today.
Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you. Really good.
It's really fascinating. Sorry, Charlie, go ahead. No, you first.
No, I was just going to say, great. Yeah, no, I really do think that those multi-piece kind of submissions and the way you can write about work like that and position it is actually a useful way that means you don't have to, you know, go away from a kind of way of working in your actual practice, in your actual creative practice. So I think that's definitely proved to us being really useful kind of mechanism for REF especially, and in the journal as well. So yeah, great.
Yeah, all I wanted to add is that kind of to second what Paul says, I think it does bring me confidence as well, that, you know, having these kind of conversations and seeing how much of fantastic things is going on. And actually, I should mention at the very beginning of this seminar, I did ask participants to give me an overview of what they're working on, and it was just really, really fascinating to see the range and variety and really a crazy creative approach, sometimes just really unexpected things. It was just really, it was mind-blowing to see how many fascinating and very unconventional things people do. I would like to get back to this towards the end of this the seminar, because the last session is really about kind of drawing conclusions from what everyone has been saying and just trying to think ahead in terms of thinking, well, so how can we use this vast knowledge people have collectively to really build this toolkit, as I call it. But I think it's really, really positive to kind of to see how all these things link together. How actually even right now in this conversation, we had this conversation between yourself, Charlie, Jackie, Paul, and all the other people who are kind of, and Carola, who is not really here. So all the elements of the seminar, how all these things we try to discuss are really very closely interlinked, and how it actually makes sense if we verbalize it. And so it's really, it makes me feel like we're doing the right thing. And as you rightly say, the more platforms we have, the more quality submissions we have, the more discussions we have around it, then there is a hope that I have a feeling that there's a momentum in relation to practice-based research, and definitely dissemination is a massive part of it, because, as I said at the beginning, we can do amazing things, but if we don't communicate that, then nothing's gonna happen. And I'm guilty of doing this for many years of my life. I did lots of things which just stayed in my drawers, and I just, you know, it was a good thing, because now I try to do things to prevent other people from just sitting quietly and keeping things in the drawers. But I think it's really important to kind of have these discussions, continue developing places, venues, platforms, and just doing things we do. So thank you so much, Charlie. It was absolutely wonderful to have you here today. Thank you so much for all the amazing examples, and thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much, everyone who made it to the session today, and for those of you who are watching this afterwards, I'm gonna publish the recording later today or the latest tomorrow. And next time, on the last Wednesday of March, we're gonna have Jackie, who's gonna be talking about impact. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye now.
Thank you very much. Bye.